I appreciate you joining me for another Todd Talk. We take teaching theory and turn it into teaching practice. So this is another video in the series on executive functioning skills. Executive functioning skills, if you remember, are the building blocks that students use in order to be successful. So these are things like planning, time management, focus, perseverance. And there are 10 executive functioning skills that these videos are covering. Today, we're specifically going to be talking about the idea of metacognition. So you might wonder, what is metacognition? Well, its definition is right there in the name. Meta is towards yourself. To be meta is towards yourself. Cognition is then thinking. So this is your own thinking. So how do you think? And so it's basically thinking about thinking and being aware why you think things a certain way and why you do certain actions a certain way. So being aware of this is really important, because if you're aware of why you think or why you're doing whatever, you can then repeat that. So I did this because of this, and if I repeat it, the likelihood of me having a positive outcome is going to happen. But if you're not aware, you don't know what your weaknesses are, and you repeat those weaknesses, then the chances of you failing or not being successful are going to happen. So it's important to know, as a learner, as a human being, what our weaknesses and strengths are. So you may wonder, how do I teach this in my class? So the metacognition breaks down into 3 steps, really. And those steps are, number 1, having an awareness of things. Number 2, once you have that awareness, then implementing strategies to take advantage of your strengths and kind of workarounds or hacks for your weaknesses. And so what this is going to look like is it's being able to do things and then monitor them to make sure that they stay consistent. The third aspect is then reflection. So if we're going to get better, we need to consistently and constantly reflect. What went well? What didn't? Why was it? Why was that not successful? Why was that successful? So I can repeat that again. So having this reflection is going to then help you further on. This is where we learn from our mistakes. This is where we learn from our successes. But we're learning, if we don't reflect, we don't have that deep learning that we want so that we can become better learners. So you may ask first, so how do I teach awareness in the class? And so keep in mind, you have some students that suffer from what I call American Idol syndrome. American Idol, if you're not familiar, is a reality show where people come in and they sing songs a cappella to a group of judges, usually celebrity judges. And what I always find interesting is that at the very beginning of the audition process, you'll get people that come in that think that they are the greatest singers. They're like, oh, I'm wonderful. I take voice lessons. My mom says I'm great, whatever. And then they get up and they sing, and they are horrible. And they finish their singing with a huge smile on their face, like they just did the greatest thing ever. And the judges just look appalled at what they just heard. And when the judges break the news that their singing was not as good as they think it is, the person seems shocked and appalled and offended that that's the case. And so you have students like this that think they possess strengths where they don't. Because they think they have the strength, they'll keep going to that, even though in reality it's actually a weakness. And so it actually hurts them not being aware of what their strengths and weaknesses are. So we need to help students to figure out, what are they strong at? What are they weak at? What is the best way that they learn? So you might be asking yourself then, how do you figure out what the strengths and weaknesses of your students are? So one way is to determine what is their learning style. And you can do this in numerous ways. Could be observations, could be, questionnaires and asking them how they feel about certain things. But there are also specific questionnaires that you can ask, like the VARK questionnaire. So you may be asking, what is VARK? And so as you see here, VARK stands for visual, auditory, reading, and kinesthetic. And so using the VARK questionnaire, students figure out if they're a visual learner, or they learn by seeing, whether they're an auditory learner, which means they learn by hearing, whether they're reading and writing, they learn by reading and writing, or kinesthetic, which is more hands-on, they learn by doing. And so what they would do is then they would take a questionnaire which you see kind of here, and this is made up of questions that ask things such as the following. I need to find the way to a shop that a friend has recommended. I would, A, find out where the shop is in relation to somewhere I know. B, ask my friend to tell me the directions. C, write down the street directions I need to remember. Or D, use a map. And so students go through and they answer all these questions. And then depending on how they answer, it lines up with one of the VARC. So for question number 1, if they answered an A, that is a kinesthetic. A B is an auditory. A C would have been reading and writing. And D would have been the visual. So through the series of questions, what students are figuring out without even knowing necessarily is what kind of learning style they have. There are other learning styles that you can give as well. I know the learning style where it looks at visual, auditory, kinesthetic, logical, interpersonal, intrapersonal is another type of learning style assessment that you can give students. But the idea here is that you're just creating awareness for yourself and for the students. This is how I learn. This is how I best learn. So if this is how I best learn, then I want to expose myself to this type of learning. So if I learn best visually, I should maybe watch a video on something rather than reading about it. If I'm a hands-on person, then I should do something hands-on rather than just listening to someone give a lecture. So you want to try to match up the learning with the learning style that students use best. This is how they can use their strengths by being able to figure that out. So like I said, awareness is the first part. So creating awareness in students. You could also give a questionnaire like you see here, which is just asking their opinion, where it will say, it has questions like, how do you best learn? And it gives them a scenario and they would just like evaluate for themselves. Of course, the problem is if a student suffers from American Idol syndrome, they're not aware of how sometimes students answer how they want to be, not how they are. So sometimes it can be difficult to see your weaknesses. So teachers can also evaluate, what they see in students and the kind of work they get and how good that work is depending on what style it is. But there are ways, but you need to help a student as best as possible determine what kind of learner they are. And this way they're aware of which way they will learn best. And they should probably figure out also why that's the way that they learn best and how that can be done. The second part to learning metacognition in the classroom is then developing the strategies or using strategies in the classroom that are going to help to play to these strengths and to make sure that they monitor it along the way. So this basically comes down to 3 steps when they're in the process of doing the work. It's planning, which we've talked about in one of our executive functioning skills videos. It is monitoring. How are things going? Could they be going better? What is working? What is not? That also kind of ties into awareness as they're going along. And then lastly is evaluating. So then once you get to the end, and this is also going to kind of overlap with reflection, what worked, what didn't, how can I avoid things that didn't work? How can I continue to do things that do work? And so here are some specific strategies that you might want to consider when teaching students how to use the strategies that are going to play to their strength. So the first one is you might want to use a syllabus or a rubric because this acts as a roadmap. So if you have a project for students, you have an activity or whatever, they should be very aware of what it is they need to do to be successful. Because then they can say, okay, here is my strength, how I can get to that point. Or this is my weakness, this is how can I avoid that, trying to get to that point. So students need to be able to see the finish line. And so one way you can show them the finish line is by giving them a syllabus, which kind of gives an overview on what the end game of the project is going to be, and providing them with a rubric, which sets the expectations. These are what we expect of you. This is what you should be able to do. And then students can figure out the strategies, or you can help them to find the strategies that are best going to allow them to use these. A second strategy when it comes to trying to use your strengths and weaknesses is thinking aloud. Now, of course, a student can't necessarily do this in the classroom, but I know when I do work, I think out loud. because I want to make sure that I'm going through the steps that I need to go through. And so I'll say to myself, I'll speak to myself, even when I'm working down in the basement by myself. I need to make sure I do this, or this is over here. I need to make sure it goes over here. And just putting it out there just helps me to remember what it is I need to do. So getting students, they're not going to necessarily have to talk out loud, but they need to think in their head, okay, have an inner monologue. This is why I'm doing what I'm doing. And this seems to be working, or this doesn't seem to be working. But being able to kind of hear your thoughts. And again, if you're able to verbalize that in privacy, that's great. That's even better. But it's just about being aware of those thoughts and why you're doing what it is that you're doing. A third thing is ask yourself questions. So be willing to be hard on yourself. Okay. Why did you do that? What did you hope to accomplish by doing that? What do you hope to accomplish? How are you going to change in order to get what you want to accomplish? They always say the definition of an insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over and expecting a different result. So if you keep using the same strategies and they don't work, they're going to continue to not work. So you need to make a change. You need to change the plan. You need to be able to adjust. So a fourth strategy that you can use with students is the idea of then showing your work. We tell this to students all the time. When you're doing the math problem, show your work. Well, the reason why they show that work is so that we can understand their thought process. We can see that and we can help them. Same thing when they're outlining for an essay. Have them turn in the outline. Have them turn in their brainstorming session. We want to see how they're thinking. We want to see, what they're thinking about the thinking. And that way we can ensure that they're going to produce a quality product because they've given some thought. They have a clear strategy for how they're going to achieve. Because what happens is when students don't have a clear strategy, then it's very difficult to achieve what they want to achieve. So you've got to be sure that they've got the understanding of what the finish line is through a rubric and syllabus, and they can work towards that by showing their work and thinking aloud, and all those strategies to help them during the process. A fifth one is monitoring. So what does it mean by monitoring? So it means you have to take stock every once in a while of how things are going. What you don't want to do is you don't want to head down a pathway that's not going to lead you to success for very long. Sometimes you go down those paths, and that's okay. But you don't want them going all the way down the path. You want them getting about halfway and saying, this is not the right way to go. So I'm going to go back up to the main path and try another one. But again, this is that awareness that we want students to have. But sometimes we have to really help them to understand this awareness through the strategies they're using and what works and what doesn't. It becomes a trial and error. Okay, this worked, this did not. This worked this time, maybe it'll work next time. If it doesn't work next time, maybe it's never going to work. And so using this trial and error, you learn about yourself and you learn what your styles are and how you can be successful. So that is the second thing, is to look at strategies for implementing what it is that you want to implement. The last one I'm going to talk about is the idea of reflection. And this is something I think we skip a lot in the classroom. We do a lot of having self-awareness, or we do use pre-assessments on what students know and things of that nature. We monitor and look at strategies as we're going along with students, but very rarely at the end, after the summative, do we reflect upon what we learned. Now, reflecting might be going on all throughout the process, but are we formalizing that at the end and taking a look at the whole picture? Okay, was this a success? Was this not? Why was it a success? Can I repeat that in the future? Why did this fail? Is that something I can avoid the next time? So again, through this reflection, they're learning from their mistakes. Of course, you have to make sure that you give them purposeful reflection, because sometimes students don't reflect very well. So here's a very simple example of a reflection that you can do with students. Okay, this is the stoplight one. You can see the red one here. Today my learning stopped because, so this is going to allow them to look at what are my weaknesses, what are things that get in my way. When they're doing the yellow one, it's today I considered a question, new idea or new perspective. And what was that new idea? Why did you consider it? How did this help you get you towards your goal? And lastly, the green light is today I understood and learned, and whatever it was, but also not just what was learned, But why do you think you were able to learn that? How did you go about learning that? Again, having this awareness of what you're strong at and what you're not strong at is going to be very successful. So you can see here I've given you a link to a number of reflections that I have on my website that you can use. And so I like to use these protocols with students, especially when they're first starting to reflect, because students typically don't reflect. And so they need to have some guidance. Once I get later in the year and they've been doing reflections for a while, I can simply say to them, reflect upon the practices. And they've got those protocols in their head now. They can do those things. But we need to make sure we get them some guidance on this when we're doing it at first. We don't want to assume that they can reflect. Because some people, the way that some students reflect is they only focus on the grade that was achieved. So I got an F, so it was a failure. Well, not really. What from it did you learn from getting that grade? Or it was an A, it was success. Not necessarily. You may have gotten an A not because of things that you did, but just because you turned it in or accomplished it or whatever. But how could you create a quality work? And so students sometimes, for good reason, focus on the grade and then use that as a determiner of success. A reflection is not looking at the grade. The reflection is looking more at the intrinsic. Why was this? Do you think this was a success? Why do you think this was not as much of a success as you wanted it to be? Why was this? Okay. What caused these things? And be aware of these things. So again, so you can go to your strengths and use them as tools and to have workarounds for your weaknesses. So I'll give you an example I think I've given before. I forget things. My working memory is not the best. So knowing that about myself, I have learned to use Post-it notes. And I write down or jot down notes all the time and then put them on a Post-it note because it's hard to lose a Post-it note. Sometimes I write it on my hand even because you can't lose your hand, at least not in a good way. And so if I definitely need to remember something, I'll write it on my hand and be able to refer that because then I'm not going to lose it. I also am very aware through years and years and years that I'm a visual learner. So I figure this out when I'm reading the directions for something. I really struggle when I'm reading the directions or when or someone's telling me something. But when I watch it on a video and I see people doing it, it becomes something clicks and I really understand it a lot more. So I'm a visual learner. And so being aware of this, I know when I have a task to do that reading the directions are not going to be the best way to do it. And so I'll pull up a YouTube video and I've done everything from how to change, a shower faucet to how to change the wire on my weed whacker to how to play a board game. So I go to YouTube and I pull these videos up because I'm aware of my strengths. And this allows me to learn it at a better quality than if I had just tried to read the directions and I'm misunderstanding things. So if you're going to create metacognition in your students, you need to be purposeful about it and you need to have strategies yourself. So help them to become more aware. Use learning strategies inventories or VARC questionnaires in order to help them become aware of how they learn best. Make sure that you suggest strategies to them where they can use these in place. But you also have to have a classroom where they have choice in the strategies they use. If you say everyone must learn it this way, then they're not getting to choose their strengths or avoid their weaknesses. They have to do what you're asking them to do. So if you say by learning about this, you're going to read an article. Well, that's going to work really well with your readers, but your visual people maybe watch a video, or your kinesthetic people, they might want to create something, or your uh, auditory people might have to hear it from you. You may have to explain it to them. So you need to have options for the process of learning and when they're actually going through the learning that they have some choice in that matter. And then the last thing, of course, is the reflection. And you need to be purposeful about giving them ideas of how they can reflect, asking the right questions, helping them to come to their why. Because if they can't come to their why, they're not going to learn why they're successful. But if you can say to a kid, I want you to show your work, and they say, why? And you say, because I need to see it. Frame it differently. Frame it like, I want to see how you're thinking. I want to see that you understand the mathematical thinking you're doing by showing your work. Or I want to see where your idea started and where it went to when you're brainstorming for an essay. I want to see that process. And because you can't see into the head of people, you can't read their minds, I need to see your work so that I can get an idea of how you're thinking, and so I can best help you. So in closing, there are some things that you can do in your classroom to ensure or to help students gain awareness, to come up with true strategies that are going to help them be successful, and to reflect upon what it is that they're doing. So if you do these things, it's going to help students along in this process of learning metacognition. So one thing you can do is have more wait time. A lot of times in classroom, we ask questions and we immediately are looking for answers. But what if we give them some time to think? So if we want them to think about the thinking, they have to have the time to be able to do that. And so I use what's called wait time, which is I'll do this in a couple of different ways. So if I'm asking questions of my students, I'll say, here's the question. Take 2 minutes to think about it. I want anyone raising their hand for the first 2 minutes. And then after 2 minutes, then I'll allow kids to raise their hand. But it's given them time to form and if you have students whose weakness is processing speed, so some students need some time to kind of wrestle with the idea before they come up with a really meaningful answer. And so this wait time allows them to do that. It also slows down those kids that are impulsive and come up with the surface level answer instead of really thinking about their thinking. Another way to approach this is sometimes I'll do pre-writing activities with students. I'll say to them, here's the question, now write about this for a couple of minutes, and then we're going to discuss it. And then after I've given them a couple minutes to think and brainstorm and write down ideas, we talk about it. And the conversation is so much more meaningful and has so much more depth because they've had some time to think about it and they're thinking about their thinking. So again, the first piece of advice is more wait time. Okay. The second piece of advice is encourage them to show their work in everything, whether math, English, social studies, whatever. We're not looking for answers. We're looking for process. We want to see the process they're going through. I think sometimes we teach kids to find the correct answer, and that's all they care about. So if they find the correct answer, that's all that matters. Whether they understand it or not doesn't matter. It's that they got the correct answer. You need to create a culture in your classroom where that's not the case, where it's not about finding the answer. It's looking at the process. I once talked to a math teacher who she did not grade math work based upon correct answers. She graded the math work based upon the process that she saw in the work that they did. Were they mathematically thinking correctly? That's what she cared about. Because the right answer doesn't mean anything if you don't know how you got it or why you got there. So encourage students as much as possible to show their work. Even when they're developing something, go through the engineering design process, which you see here, which is to plan and do all these things, but then improve upon it. Think about what you're doing and make it better. So that's going to be very helpful and for students to be able to think about the thinking. A third thing you might want to consider is make sure that you model your own thinking. So as a teacher, you're doing lots of things in the classroom, but make students aware of why they're doing what they're doing. So we're going to do this, students, and this is why I'm doing it this way, because I want you to get this out of it. I want you to learn this. And so allow them kind of a glimpse into your own thinking. And by thinking aloud, by making them aware of that, they see how that works and why you're doing what you're doing. So you're not doing this work to punish them. So if you say, I'm giving you 20 problems, I'm giving you 20 problems because I really want you to practice what it is that you learned. And the more that you do it, the more comfortable you'll get with it and the better you'll be at it. And so this is just a practice session. And so just explaining that to them does a couple things. It justifies why they're doing what they're doing and why you made the decisions that you made as a teacher. The fourth thing to think about is the idea of the zone of proximal development. And I have a Todd talk on this that you can watch. And the zone of proximal development is making sure that that you're challenging students just enough to keep them, thinking. So if students aren't thinking, they're not learning. So if they're able to do something without having to think about it, then they haven't learned that. An example would be like tying your shoe. We don't think about tying our shoes anymore because we've done it so often. We've done it so long. We know how to do it so well. We just tie our shoes. There's not much thought given to it. But But if we want students then to think about it, we need to keep moving the challenge. So then how do we tie this knot or this knot or this knot? Like, so we're continuing to move that challenge forward so that students can then have to think. When students have to think too much though, when they think and they can't make sense of it, we don't want to be in that area of the learning target. We want to be in the middle, which you see on this chart right here, which is the zone of proximal development, where we're challenging students enough to have them thinking about it. And that's where the learning takes place. So you need to think about, whenever you're doing something, am I challenging students? And so what that means is that you may have to differentiate, because some students may be learning at different levels. So if you're giving it a very basic level, but a student already has a really good understanding, they're not thinking about the learning at all. They're not learning. How can we get them to that point? How can we extend it? How can we make it more challenging for that particular student? The last thing is the idea of using rubrics. I also have a Todd talk on how to construct a rubric. I think it's really important that that you use rubrics with students whenever you have any sort of project or activity or performance assessment, because they need to be, even when you're grading an essay. So sometimes students would turn in an essay, teacher grades it, they give a grade back, and the student doesn't know why they got what they got. They don't know what they did well. They don't know what they didn't do well. How many times have you done a paper and you've gotten a grade back with no comments, and you have no idea, even if you got an A, you have no idea how you got that A? So we need to make sure that students are aware of the why. And a rubric helps to point that out. This is what you did that was successful, that you can continue to do. This needs some improvement. This is a weakness of yours. This is something that you can make better. So using a rubric like you see here is going to help them to see, the why. Okay, why did they get what they get? So this just kind of takes the idea of the assessment and gives them an idea that they can see the thinking behind the assessment and why they got what they got. So those are some things that you can do with your students in class to make sure that you help them with their metacognition.